On the 12th of February 1996, in the heart of South Africa, a little girl named Hannah Cornelius entered the world inside a family shaped by intellect, discipline, and deep moral purpose. Her father, Willem Cornelius, was a respected judge whose courtroom reputation rested on a sharp legal mind and an unwavering commitment to fairness. Her mother, Anna, was a practicing attorney who brought the same rigor home, raising her children with structure, warmth, and a quiet but steady expectation of excellence. From the very beginning, Hannah, known to everyone around her simply as Han, was a child who seemed to carry an extraordinary brightness within her. She was not merely intelligent in the academic sense, though her academic record would later speak powerfully for itself, but rather she possessed a rare combination of intellectual sharpness and emotional generosity that set her apart from her earliest years. She was the kind of child who noticed when someone was struggling before they said a word, who instinctively reached toward others with patience and encouragement rather than pulling away. That quality was never more evident than in her relationship with her younger brother, who lived with severe autism and faced daily challenges that would have exhausted the patience of most people around him. Han never wavered. She sat beside him with a gentle persistence, guiding him through his academic struggles with a steadiness that many adults could not have summoned, and she did it not out of obligation, but out of genuine love. That deep well of compassion coexisted in her with a vivid artistic soul that her closest friends and family came to cherish. She was a prodigy at the piano, capable of drawing entire rooms into silence with her playing, and she demonstrated a natural and promising theatrical talent that pointed toward a life rich with creative expression. When Han graduated from secondary school, she did so with 6 distinctions and an average score exceeding 85%, a result that placed her comfortably among the top performers in her region. Yet for those who truly knew her, that transcript only captured one corner of who she was. Behind every number on that certificate was a young woman who had spent her evenings practicing scales until her fingers ached, rehearsing lines for school productions, and sitting patiently beside her brother long after the rest of the household had gone to sleep. She stepped into adulthood glowing with possibility, deeply in love with a young man named Fanilo, and fired by a genuine and widening curiosity about the world. Her decision to pursue a degree in the arts felt entirely natural to those who had watched her grow, and her parents, both anchored in the world of law, supported that choice with the quiet pride of people who recognized that their daughter had found her own path. There was likely some parental anxiety woven into that pride, the tender, almost universal fear of watching a beloved child spread their wings and venture beyond the shelter of the family home, but it was a fear built entirely on love rather than doubt. In the summer of 2015, Han Cornelius began her journey at Stellenbosch University, one of South Africa's most prestigious academic institutions, nestled in the lush wine country of the Western Cape. She moved into the Iron Women's residence with the energy of someone who had been waiting for this chapter her whole life. To ease the daily logistics of campus life, her 90-year-old grandmother gave her a gift that would become one of the most recognizable symbols of her story, an old blue and white Volkswagen City Golf, a modest and slightly weathered car that carried within it an entire generation of family trust and affection. It was the kind of gift that meant something far beyond transportation. It was a grandmother's way of saying, "I believe in you, go and live your life well." Han accepted it with the same warmth with which it was given, and soon became a familiar sight behind its wheel, navigating the streets of Stellenbosch with the easy confidence of someone who had quickly made this town her own. Her time at university was full and purposeful. In the lecture halls, she dove headfirst into her humanities coursework with the methodical discipline her upbringing had instilled in her. But her contribution to the world around her extended well beyond the classroom. She made regular voluntary trips to the Tears Animal Rescue Center in Cape Town, giving her free time to an organization dedicated to the welfare of animals who had no voice of their own. It was a choice that spoke volumes about her character, a young woman who could have spent those hours on any number of pleasures that university life affords, but instead chose to invest in something larger than herself. It was precisely this quality, this instinctive orientation toward others, that drew people to her and helped her build genuine and lasting friendships with remarkable ease. Among those friendships, one would prove especially significant. At the beginning of her second year at Stellenbosch, Han met Cheslin Marsh, a theology student whose own quiet seriousness and deep sense of purpose resonated immediately with her own values. What grew between them was a friendship of genuine purity and depth, built not on convenience or proximity alone, but on mutual respect, shared humor, and a natural chemistry of two people who simply understood each other. Cheslin was diligent in his studies, but sometimes struggled under the pressure of theological coursework, and Han, with her characteristic warmth and patience, was always ready to sit beside him and work through the difficult material together. There was no condescension in her help and no reluctance. She gave her time freely because that was simply who she was. Those who observed them together described a circle of safety and trust between two young people who seemed to bring out the best in each other, a friendship that both of them likely expected to last a lifetime. Neither of them could have imagined, in those ordinary afternoons of study and laughter, that the bond they had built was soon to face an unimaginable test. As 2017 began, Han and Cheslin were both ambitious second-year students navigating the pressures of examinations, assignment deadlines, and the slowly crystallizing questions of what their futures might hold. It had been a long and demanding week of intensive study, and on the evening of Friday, the 26th of May, they chose to decompress in the way that so many university students do, gathering with a group of friends for a relaxed and unhurried night together. The evening was light and easy. They played dominoes, a pastime deeply familiar in South African social circles, and the hours dissolved in the comfortable rhythm of easy conversation and shared laughter. The gathering had the quality of those rare evenings where time simply disappears, where the weight of exams and future plans lifts temporarily, and there is nothing but the warmth of being together. The conversation stretched from the evening of Friday deep into the early hours of Saturday, the 27th of May, 2017. When the gathering finally wound down, Han had originally planned to drive herself home alone, but Cheslin, governed by the kind of quiet, protective instinct that defined his character, had no intention of letting her leave without company. He picked up his skateboard and offered to accompany her back to the Irene residence on foot. It was the gesture of a loyal and caring friend, and under different circumstances, it would simply have been another small, unremarkable act of decency. But it was Han's own warmth that changed what happened next. She could not bear the thought of Cheslin returning home alone in the dark hours of early morning on nothing more than a skateboard. Despite his polite and repeated insistence that he would be perfectly fine, Han refused to accept it. She told him to get into the blue and white Volkswagen Golf, reasoning, as any caring friend would, that the steel of the car would keep them both safer than a skateboard on the open road at 3 in the morning. Cheslin gave in, as friends do when someone they trust insists with enough love. They climbed in together, and Han pulled away from the curb heading toward Cheslin's home, both of them completely unaware that their mutual kindness, the very quality that made their friendship beautiful, was in that moment quietly placing them in the path of something neither of them could have prepared for. At approximately 3:23 in the morning, Han parked the blue and white Volkswagen on a small patch of grass near Cheslin's home. The two of them sat together in the warmth of the car, stretching out the last of the evening in unhurried conversation. It was the natural ending to a good night. Outside, the streets of Stellenbosch were quiet and still, as they almost always are at that hour, and there was nothing in the air to suggest that anything other than ordinary darkness surrounded them. Then, without any warning that could have prepared them, 4 figures moved silently along the road nearby. These were not men passing by chance. They were predators operating with a cold and deliberate calculation, and the moment they registered the parked car with 2 young occupants inside, their decision was made in an instant. Using a nearby truck as cover to conceal their approach, they converged on the Volkswagen with swift and practiced efficiency. The last moment of safety that Han and Cheslin would know for a very long time was shattered by a sudden impact against the car door. The passenger door was wrenched open, and both young people found themselves confronted by sharp instruments, a screwdriver and a folding knife, pressed against their bodies with unmistakable intent. The 4 men forced their way inside. What had been a peaceful, private space became within seconds a scene of terror. One of the attackers, a man named Nashville Julius, had served as a lookout and departed shortly after the takeover, having completed his role. The remaining 3, Vernon Whitboy, Gerald O'Parsons, and Eben van Niekerk, took brutal control of the situation. Han was forced from the driver's seat and crammed into the narrow space between the 2 front seats, trapped between Vernon Whitboy and Gerald O'Parsons with no room to move and no possibility of escape. In the back seat, Cheslin was pinned to the floor by Eben van Niekerk, pressed down with a violence designed to eliminate any prospect of resistance. At approximately 3:40 in the morning, the blue and white Volkswagen Golf rolled away from that quiet street, carrying 5 people and only 2 of them with any will of their own. For Han and Cheslin, locked into that suffocating space, the hours that followed would stretch into a nightmare whose full dimensions they were only beginning to understand. The car disappeared from surveillance cameras and was not picked up again for more than an hour. During that missing stretch of time, somewhere on the dark and dusty roads that lead out from the edges of Stellenbosch, the attackers made a decision that escalated the horror enormously. They stopped the car and forced Cheslin out of the back seat, stripped him of his jacket and his shoes, and locked him inside the trunk of the vehicle. The darkness of that confined space, the cold air through thin clothing, and the sounds of the road passing beneath him would have been terrifying beyond description. He was now completely isolated, unable to communicate with Han, with no knowledge of where he was being taken or what awaited him when the trunk eventually opened. At 4:34 in the morning, the Volkswagen reappeared on camera at a petrol station on the outskirts of Stellenbosch. Surveillance footage captured a figure wearing a light jacket in the front passenger seat, while Vernon Whitby walked calmly into the station's convenience store carrying a wallet. He had obtained a PIN from Cheslin during the ordeal in the car, and he attempted to withdraw cash from the accounts inside the wallet. Every attempt failed. Investigators would later reflect on what that failure represented, because it appears that Cheslin, even while terrified and confined in the dark of the trunk, had deliberately provided a false PIN number. It was a small act of defiance in an utterly powerless situation, a moment of courage that was almost certainly not made without awareness of the risk it carried. That false PIN could not stop what was coming, but it was the kind of choice that speaks to the character of a young man who refused to surrender everything, even when everything had already been taken from him. The group drove on from the petrol station, heading now in the direction of a neighboring area known at the time as Kryfontein. The atmosphere inside that car, from what investigators would later piece together, was one of menace and volatility. Han, trapped between two of the men in the front seat, made the quiet and considered decision to cooperate fully, to keep her eyes forward, to give them no reason to escalate. She did not plead, did not struggle, did not look back. She held herself together with a composure that speaks to an extraordinary inner strength, attempting in the only way available to her to preserve what remained of her safety. Meanwhile, the men used the vehicle to conduct further criminal activity in the area, moving through neighborhoods and attempting to traffic narcotics, while the car continued its grim circuit through the early morning darkness. From inside the sealed trunk, Cheslin was kicking frantically at the lining of the boot, driven by a desperate and instinctive need to signal his presence, to find a way out, or simply to do something against the helplessness that surrounded him. At approximately 5:30 in the morning, the car came to an abrupt stop on the outskirts of Kryfontein. The men offered Hannah hollow reassurance, telling her they were only stopping to smoke and that the car would be returned once they reached their destination. Those words were lies. Two of the men moved to the rear of the vehicle and opened the trunk. Cheslin was pulled out into the open air, still without shoes, and escorted by the two figures to a clearing away from the car. Investigators later described the scene as isolated ground, well away from any immediate traffic or witnesses, a location chosen with clear intent. Cheslin was ordered to lie down on the ground. When he looked up from that position and saw the silhouettes of two men standing above him holding large rocks, he understood with a devastating clarity what was about to happen. In the moments that followed, he was subjected to a brutal and sustained attack. A rock weighing approximately 40 kilograms was used against him. The assault left him with a severe head injury and permanent hearing loss in one ear. His attackers then left him there on the ground, believing him to be beyond recovery, and returned to the car. Hannah Cornelius was driven further away from that spot. What happened to her in those final hours, the precise sequence of events, the details of the suffering she endured before her life was taken, belong to the category of truths too cruel and too sacred to lay out with clinical description. What the evidence made undeniable is that she was subjected to deeply serious harm before she lost her life. Her body was discovered later that morning not far from the scene, in the open landscape outside the town. She was 21 years old. She had been studying, laughing, playing piano, and caring for the people she loved just hours before her life came to its violent and senseless end. When her parents, Willem and Anna Cornelius, received the news that their daughter had been found, the world they had built around her memory, her childhood achievements, her piano recitals, her carefully nurtured ambitions, collapsed entirely. There are no words that adequately describe what that morning cost them. Back on the ground where Cheslin had been left for dead, a remarkable story of survival was quietly unfolding. Despite the severity of his injuries, despite the blood loss and the trauma and the cold ground beneath him and the absence of shoes, Cheslin Marsh survived. He was discovered and received urgent medical attention. His recovery would be long and marked by profound psychological suffering, but he was alive, and in the days and weeks that followed, his survival would become one of the most critical elements in the pursuit of justice for Hannah. The men responsible for these crimes did not attempt to flee the region or go into hiding. Instead, displaying a shocking and almost incomprehensible arrogance, they continued operating in the Kryfontein area as though the night had simply been another evening of criminal activity with no meaningful consequences to fear. Their behavior in the hours immediately following the attack illustrated a complete disregard for human life and for the gravity of what they had done. At some point that same morning, they robbed a woman who was on her way to work, snatching her bag and her phone in a street assault that was carried out without hesitation. Then, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon of that same day, less than 12 hours after they had forced themselves into Hannah's car in the quiet early hours before dawn, they struck again. A second woman was abducted in a terrifying carjacking that was captured by surveillance cameras at a Shell petrol station. The footage showed the blue and white Volkswagen Golf pulling up, with the woman visible in the rear seat being restrained by Eben van Niekerk in a manner that directly mirrored the night before. Vernon Whitby walked calmly to a nearby ATM and withdrew 3,000 rand from the woman's account before the group eventually abandoned her on a remote rural road. After dividing the stolen money among themselves and dropping Eben van Niekerk at his home, Vernon Whitby and Gerald O'Parsons even attempted to sell the blue and white Volkswagen, the car that had belonged to Hannah's grandmother, approaching strangers they encountered and trying to broker a transaction with the casualness of men who felt entirely untouchable. What they did not realize, as they moved through those hours of continued criminality, was that the authorities had already been mobilized with significant urgency, and that their every movement was falling steadily within the crosshairs of a coordinated and determined response. The investigation into Hannah's disappearance had begun the moment she and Cheslin failed to return, and the evidence trail they had left across petrol station cameras, ATM machines, and witness accounts was narrowing around them with the quiet inevitability of a closing net. Law enforcement worked through the morning and afternoon piecing together a timeline from surveillance footage, witness testimonies, and forensic indicators gathered from the areas where the attacks had occurred. The blue and white Volkswagen Golf, known and traceable, had appeared on camera multiple times, and the identities of those connected to it were becoming clearer with every passing hour. The investigation involved coordination between multiple units, and the determination driving those efforts was fed not only by professional duty, but by the weight of what had been taken from a young woman who had done nothing more than offer her friend a ride home. By late afternoon, an unmarked patrol vehicle identified the target vehicle moving through the area. A pursuit was initiated immediately, with a second unmarked unit providing backup support and closing off potential exit routes. The chase that followed was rapid and desperate. Vernon Whitby and Gerald O'Parsons, the last two from the group still in the vehicle, understood that the net had closed and attempted to push through the containment by driving at speed toward the entrance of a private farm on the outskirts of the area. Bystanders who witnessed the pursuit could do nothing but watch as a detective stepped out of his vehicle and gave chase on foot with unwavering determination. But the security gate at the far end of the farm entrance brought the Volkswagen to a hard and final stop. There was nowhere left to go. One of the two men made a desperate bid for escape by jumping into a nearby river. The attempt was futile. Both men were apprehended at gunpoint within minutes, brought to the ground, and placed in restraints. For all the brutality and arrogance that had defined their behavior over the preceding 14 hours, the end came for them in a patch of grass by a locked gate, while investigators stood over them with the quiet authority of people who had done exactly what they came to do. In custody and faced with the full weight of the evidence against them, Vernon Whitby and Gerald O'Parsons did not wait long before identifying their remaining associates. Both men gave up the names of Nashville Julius and Eben van Niekerk, and by the following day, all four individuals connected to the attack on Hannah and Cheslin had been arrested. The criminal wave that had begun in the pre-dawn darkness of Saturday, May 27th, and continued brazenly through the daylight hours that followed, was over. What awaited now was the long and often painfully slow process of justice. In the weeks and months following the arrests, the full horror of what had taken place gradually became public knowledge, and the response across South Africa was one of grief, outrage, and a renewed and anguished conversation about the epidemic of violence against women that has long plagued the country. Hannah Cornelius was not the first young South African woman to lose her life to senseless violence, and the devastating reality is that she was not the last. Her story landed differently for many people, perhaps because of the particular cruelty of its details, perhaps because of how ordinary the moments leading up to it had been. Two friends saying goodnight in a parked car, a small act of kindness setting in motion, a catastrophe that no one could have predicted. The name Hannah Cornelius became, for many, a symbol of everything that was being lost in a country struggling to protect its most vulnerable citizens. For Willem and Anna Cornelius, the period following their daughter's death was one of almost unbearable suffering. They moved through those days wrapped in a grief that had no bottom, a loss so total and so senseless that no language of comfort could reach it. Yet even in the depths of that darkness, they made the choice to convert their grief into something that could carry Hannah's spirit forward. They established the Hannah Cornelius Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting and protecting young people facing difficult circumstances, an extension into the world of the compassion and generosity that had defined their daughter's life. It was a profound act of love in the face of devastation, and it gave something of Hannah back to the world that had taken her. But the tragedy of that year was not finished with the Cornelius family. In March of 2018, less than 12 months after Hannah's life was taken, Anna Cornelius was found in the waters of the South Atlantic Ocean. The official record designated her death as an accidental drowning. Willem, however, carried a different and more painful understanding. He believed that his wife, having survived the unsurvivable loss of their daughter, had made the deliberate choice to walk into that ocean and let it take her. Grief she had carried since the morning they lost Hannah had never lifted. It had deepened in silence until it became a weight that no person could hold indefinitely. For Willem, the loss of Anna compounded the loss of Hannah into something that reached beyond what words are equipped to describe. A family that had once been whole, built around laughter and music, and the quiet satisfaction of raising exceptional children, had been reduced by senseless violence to a single man carrying two unbearable absences. The trial of the four perpetrators opened formally in May of 2018, nearly a year after the attack. The case that prosecutors assembled was formidable in its completeness. Confessions provided by Vernon Whitboy and Geraldo Parsons in the immediate aftermath of their arrests formed a critical foundation, but the evidentiary architecture extended far beyond self-incrimination. Hours of surveillance footage documented the movements of the Volkswagen Golf across petrol stations, ATM locations, and public roads throughout the night and the following day. Forensic evidence gathered from the scene of Cheslin's attack and from the location where Hannah's body was found provided investigators with a physical record of what had occurred. Among the most striking pieces of evidence brought before the court was the 40-kilogram rock used in the attack on Cheslin, carried into the courtroom as a silent and devastating testament to the violence that had been inflicted. Each piece of evidence added another layer of clarity to a picture that required no interpretation. The most powerful voice in that courtroom, however, belonged to Cheslin Marsh himself. He had survived what his attackers had fully intended to be fatal. He had undergone medical treatment, carried the permanent physical consequence of hearing loss in one ear, and endured months of acute psychological trauma that had forced him to step away from his studies entirely. The road back from that experience had been long and steep, and there were undoubtedly days when the magnitude of what he had lost, his friend, his sense of safety, his uninterrupted future, must have felt overwhelming. But Cheslin walked into that courtroom and stood before the people who had done this to him and to Han. He spoke through grief that was visible in every word, his testimony delivered with a composure that must have cost him enormously. He looked at the men who had destroyed his life and the life of his closest friend, and he told the truth. Investigators and legal observers who were present that day described it as one of the most quietly courageous acts of bearing witness they had ever seen. The conduct of the four defendants throughout the trial stood in stark and sickening contrast to the dignity of those who testified against them. Despite being confronted with confessions, forensic evidence, and surveillance footage that left no credible avenue of denial, all four men refused to enter guilty pleas. More than that, they were observed on multiple occasions during the proceedings displaying expressions of amusement, smirking openly in a setting that demanded at minimum the acknowledgement of what their actions had cost two young lives. It was an exhibition of contempt for both the process of justice and for the humanity of their victims, and it registered with everyone who witnessed it as a reflection of exactly the mindset that had made those early morning hours of May 27th possible. The verdict, when it came, was unambiguous. Vernon Whitboy, Geraldo Parsons, and Eben van Niekerk were each sentenced to life imprisonment for their roles in the attack, the killing, and the additional crimes committed during those 14 hours. Nashville Julius, who had participated in the initial ambush and theft before departing, received a sentence of 22 years. The courtroom doors closed behind them on judgments they had earned through choices made in the darkness of a single catastrophic night, and the case that had gripped South Africa for more than a year reached the formal end that justice systems are designed to provide. But formal endings do not heal what has been broken. The sentences handed down could not restore Hannah Cornelius to the world. They could not give Anna back to Willem. They could not return the months that Cheslin spent unable to study, the nights spent wrestling with trauma that no person should have to carry. They could not answer Hannah's younger brother, who continued, in the uncomplicated and heartbreaking honesty of a child with severe autism, to ask when his sister was coming home. That question, asked without guile, and without any understanding of why no answer ever came, carries within it an entire dimension of loss that sits entirely outside the reach of any courtroom verdict. The statistics that form the backdrop of Hannah's story are themselves a kind of indictment. South Africa has long faced a crisis of violence directed against women that operates at a scale that strains comprehension. Investigators and advocacy organizations have documented that an average of 8 women lose their lives to violent crime in the country every single day, a rate roughly 5 times higher than the global average. Hannah Cornelius was one name on a list that stretches backward and forward across decades, joined by the names of Jade, of Aineen, of Karabo, and hundreds of others who became symbols in a war that was not of their making, and from which they deserved protection that society repeatedly failed to provide. Each of those names belonged to a daughter, a friend, a sister, a young woman who had plans and people who loved her and a future that was taken before it could fully unfold. Cheslin Marsh has refused to let the worst of what happened to him become the defining chapter of his story. After a period of recovery that required him to step back from his academic life entirely, he returned with a purpose that had been sharpened and clarified by his ordeal. He chose to study law, a decision he has connected explicitly to the experience of watching justice both fail and ultimately function in the case that defined his early adulthood. He has spoken of wanting to become a shield for people who find themselves as vulnerable as he and Hannah were in those hours when no one came. It is a remarkable choice, and it carries within it the unmistakable imprint of Hannah herself, her belief that knowledge and care, applied in the service of others, could make the world safer and more decent. In some deeply meaningful sense, her spirit continues to act in the world through the choices her friend has made in the years since losing her. The Hannah Cornelius Foundation continues its work, honoring her memory not through grief alone, but through the kind of active, practical generosity that characterized every year of her short life. The blue and white Volkswagen Golf that her grandmother gave her with such hope and trust has passed into the imagery of a case that South Africans will not forget easily, a small and ordinary car that became the setting for extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary courage in the same impossible night. And in the quiet of the Cornelius home, Willem carries forward the memory of two women he loved beyond measure, a wife and a daughter, both taken too soon and both deserving of a world that was capable of protecting what they offered it. The life of Hannah Cornelius was not a long one, but it was fully and beautifully lived in the years she had. She played the piano with the kind of passion that made people stop and listen. She sat beside her brother with a patience and love that never ran out. She drove her friends home in the early hours of the morning because she could not bear the thought of anyone she cared about facing the dark roads alone. She volunteered for animals who had no one else. She studied with purpose. She loved deeply and openly and without reservation. All of that goodness, all of that warmth,